The end of the line. How three small countries are physically erasing Russia's path to Europe. So here's what happened on December 4th that you might have missed. Three presidents met at a castle in Riga. Estonia's Alar Karas, Latvia's Edgars Rinkevičs, Lithuania's Gitanas Nausėda. Suits, handshakes, the usual diplomatic show. But what they talked about behind those doors wasn't usual at all. They were planning something that sounds almost like it's from the Middle Ages, in how direct it is. They're going to tear up the railroad tracks connecting their countries to Russia and Belarus, not as a symbol, literally, with heavy machines and official government orders. And here's why this matters more than almost anything else happening in Europe right now: the geography of empire control. Let me take you back for a moment, because you need to understand what these railroad tracks actually mean. When the Russian Empire grew bigger, and later, when the Soviet Union strengthened its control over Eastern Europe, railways were the veins of power. Where the rails went, Russian power followed. Military soldiers, government workers, supplies, ideas, all of it moved along those tracks. And here's the detail that matters. Those tracks are wide. Specifically, they're 15-20 millimeters wide, what's called Russian gauge. European trains run on standard gauge, 14-35 millimeters. That difference of 85 millimeters, that wasn't a mistake. It was planned. The Tsars made that choice on purpose in the 1800s. The idea was simple and brutally smart. If European trains can't physically run on Russian tracks, then European armies can't use those rails to invade Russia. Well, that weapon just turned around and is now pointing the other way. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they still have hundreds of kilometers of these Russian gauge tracks on their land, left over from Soviet times. And as long as those tracks exist, Russia keeps physical access to Europe. Russian train cars can roll right through. Goods, possibly troops, the whole system of connection stays intact. The president's meeting at Riga Castle decided that connection needs to end permanently. The Kaliningrad calculation. Now let's talk about what happens when you actually do this, because the results are huge. Start with Kaliningrad. You know Kaliningrad, that little piece of Russia squeezed between Poland and Lithuania, completely separated from the rest of Russia. It's home to about 490,000 people, mainly by rail running through Lithuania. Russian trains carrying Russian goods moving through Lithuanian land to reach Russian land. It's weird, a strange leftover from how borders were drawn after the Cold War. If Lithuania rips up those tracks at its border with Belarus, which is exactly what they're discussing, Kaliningrad becomes an island. Russia would be forced to supply it entirely by sea and air. Every ton of cargo that currently moves efficiently by rail would have to be loaded onto ships or planes. The cost multiplies enormously. We're talking billions of rubles in extra money just to keep that territory working. But here's where it gets more serious. This is also about military weakness. The Baltic Sea has become basically a NATO lake. Sweden and Finland just joined the alliance. If conflict ever came, Russian ships trying to supply Kaliningrad would be sailing through waters controlled by NATO naval forces and within range of coastal missile systems. Those supply lines would be extremely exposed. And there's a psychological part, too. Imagine you're living in Kaliningrad, and suddenly the land connection to the rest of your country is cut. You can't just take a train to Moscow anymore. You're physically cut off, dependent entirely on ships and planes that could be stopped at any moment. That creates a siege mentality, a feeling of isolation that weakens Moscow's authority in the region, the Belarus chokehold. Then there's Belarus. And this is where the economic warfare part becomes crystal clear. Belarus is landlocked. The Lukashenko regime's economy depends heavily on exports, especially potash, fertilizer, and petroleum products. Millions of tons of these goods need to reach international markets. The only affordable way to move that volume is by rail. And for years, Belarusian goods have been flowing through Lithuania to the port of Klaipėda and through Latvia to the ports of Riga and Ventspils. These Baltic ports have been Minsk's lifeline to global trade. The Baltic states are preparing to cut that lifeline. Think about what happens next. Those millions of tons of potash exports, they pile up at the border. You can't move that volume by truck. The cost would be too high. It would destroy whatever profit exists. The alternative Russia is offering is to redirect everything to St. Petersburg. But Russian ports are already crowded with Russia's own cargo. The space isn't there. The distance is much longer, and the extra costs would devastate Belarusian industry. When goods can't move, factories shut down. Workers don't get paid. The economic pressure on the Lukashenko regime would be huge, and that's exactly the point: the hybrid warfare counterstrike. Now, here's the context that makes this make sense. The Baltic states aren't doing this out of nowhere. They've been on the receiving end of Russian and Belarusian hybrid warfare for years. Remember the migrant crisis? Lukashenko, clearly with Russian backing, organized the movement of thousands of migrants to the borders of Poland and the Baltic states, using human beings as weapons to create chaos and pressure on European borders. Then there are the cyber attacks, the disinformation campaigns, the mysterious balloons being released across borders, the constant testing of defenses. The Baltic states have been playing defense. Now they're going on offense. And they're doing it in the most definite way possible, by physically removing the infrastructure that enables connection. This isn't an embargo you can lift. This isn't a border checkpoint you can negotiate about. When you rip up hundreds of kilometers of railroad track, you're making a statement that's literally set in concrete, or in this case, in the absence of steel rails. The message is clear. We don't want your money. We don't want your trains. We don't want you here. The alternative future. The alternative future. But, and this is important, the Baltic states aren't just tearing something down. They're building something to replace it. It's called Rail Baltica, an 870-kilometer fully electric high-speed rail line running from Tallinn in Estonia all the way down through Riga and Vilnius to Warsaw. European standard gauge capable of speeds up to 249 kilometers per hour, double-tracked throughout. Look at the direction. The old Russian tracks run east-west toward Moscow. Rail Baltica runs north-south toward the heart of Europe. That directional change is the whole point. It's a physical reorientation away from the Russian sphere and into the European one. And here's the military significance. When Rail Baltic is complete, NATO can move military equipment from Germany or Poland to Estonia's eastern border with Russia in hours. No transfers, no changing wheel gauges, no delays, just fast, integrated, modern logistics. Compare that to Russia's rail-based military, which is 90% dependent on those wide-gauge tracks that will no longer connect to anything once the Baltic states remove them. Russian rail cars will be stranded at the border, physically unable to proceed because their wheels don't match the track width. It's a technological difference that completely changes Russia's strategic plans in the region. This is how the map actually changes, not through dramatic military advances or sudden political revolutions, but through careful practical decisions about infrastructure. You dismantle some railroad tracks. You build new ones going in a different direction. You make it physically impossible for the old connections to work. And suddenly, the geopolitical reality has shifted in a way that can't easily be undone. The trains that once ran from Moscow to the Baltic ports, they're not running anymore. The economic integration that continued even through political tension, it's being deliberately cut. The physical remains of the Soviet Union's control over this region, they're being pulled up and hauled away. What the Baltic states are doing is simple in concept, but profound in meaning. They're removing the tracks, which means they're removing the possibility of return. Russia's path to Europe, the one built over centuries of imperial expansion, maintained through Soviet occupation, and tolerated even after independence, that path is ending. The train has left the station, and this time Russia isn't just missing the departure. Russia is watching the tracks themselves disappear behind it. This is how the future gets built and how the past gets definitively buried. 3 small countries, a few hundred kilometers of steel rail, and a decision that reshapes the strategic map of Europe. Keep watching this space because when those tracks come up, there's no putting them back.